The morning air in Crescent Pines was crisp, laced with the scent of pine needles and freshly cut grass. The quiet rhythm of suburbia echoed faintly through wind chimes and distant lawnmowers. For Ethan Rowe, this was the life he had worked so hard to earn, a life of calm. After 28 years as a firefighter in Denver, Ethan had traded sirens and smoke for hummingbirds and hydrangeas. He stood barefoot on his front porch, a steaming mug of coffee in one hand, his other resting on Max's head, his loyal German shepherd. The two of them surveyed the view like kings of a small kingdom. Ethan's driveway, wide and clean, curved down to the street where his battered but dependable Ford F-150 rested, just like it had every morning for the past 5 years. But this morning was different. Max growled low. Ethan followed his gaze and nearly dropped his coffee. A metal fence, 6 feet tall and silver as a surgeon's scalpel, now ran directly across the middle of his driveway. It had been bolted into the concrete overnight, slicing through his property like a cruel joke. A sign was zip-tied to the chain link. HOA property. Do not remove without authorization. He blinked. Once. Twice. Still there. Ethan strode down the porch steps, anger starting to simmer beneath the confusion. He reached the fence, yanked on it. Solid. On the other side, his truck sat caged in like a trapped animal. He looked around. No work trucks, no workers, no explanations. Just this gleaming insult standing where freedom had lived yesterday. Max barked once, sharp and questioning. "Yeah, buddy," Ethan muttered. "I don't get it either." He wasted no time. By 9:30 a.m., Ethan was standing inside the air-conditioned lobby of the Crescent Pines HOA management office. The place looked more like a country club than an office. Polished floors, designer furniture, and a faint hint of citrus in the air. Behind the reception desk sat Vivian Shore, the HOA president. She wore a crisp, ivory blazer, and the kind of pearls you wore when you wanted to remind people you were in charge. Her expression was polite, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. "Mr. Rowe," she said, as if she'd been expecting him. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" "You put a fence across my driveway," Ethan said, voice steady but tight. "I'd like to know why." Vivian offered a rehearsed smile. "The fence is part of our neighborhood beautification and access control initiative. It's for the safety of the community." Ethan crossed his arms. "You blocked my driveway. Without telling me, without permission. That's not beautification, that's trespassing." "Well," she said, folding her hands over a faux leather folder. "Technically speaking, the HOA owns a shared easement that runs through several driveways, including yours. We're authorized to make improvements on those spaces." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I checked my deed when I bought that house. There was no easement. Perhaps it was updated recently. The board voted on it last quarter. I wasn't informed." "You didn't attend the meeting." "I didn't know the meeting existed." Vivian gave a practiced laugh. "Well, it was posted on the bulletin board near the community center. We're not required to mail individual notices." There was a silence thick enough to cut with a spade. Ethan stared at her, and Vivian met his gaze with that same unwavering expression, like she was daring him to push harder. "I want it removed," he said. She shrugged. "You're welcome to file a formal complaint, but I wouldn't hold my breath. The board supports the decision. It's final." For a brief moment, Ethan said nothing. The man who had pulled families from burning buildings, delivered CPR under collapsing roofs, stared at this woman, this perfectly dressed dictator, and felt the kind of rage that made his hands curl into fists. But he didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't threaten. He simply said, "Then I'll see you at the next board meeting." Vivian's smile didn't falter. "Of course, we love civic engagement." Ethan turned on his heel and walked out, Max pacing at his side. That night, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Ethan sat at his desk, flipping through the original property documents he had kept filed in a fireproof box. The blueprints were clear. No easement, no shared access. His driveway was his. And something about the way Vivian had spoken, so rehearsed, so smug, told him this wasn't just about a fence. This was about control. And Ethan Rowe had fought bigger fires than this. He wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. For the next few days, James Holloway barely slept. The image of the gleaming aluminum fence, slicing through his driveway, stayed in his mind like a splinter. It wasn't just a barrier of metal. It was a symbol of arrogance, of control, of betrayal. He'd fought wars on foreign soil and watched men break under pressure far worse than this. But somehow, nothing had ever felt more personal than being told, on his own land, that he no longer had the right to access his own home. He needed allies, and fast. James started by visiting the neighborhood's oldest residents. Mrs. Morales, who had lived on Maple Glen Lane since the 70s, greeted him with a tight hug. Her husband had passed last winter, and she'd been increasingly isolated since then. "I heard what they did to you," she whispered as she poured him tea. "Karen always was too full of herself, but lately, she's changed. There's something meaner. She fines me for leaving my porch light on too long. Can you believe that?" It wasn't just Mrs. Morales. James knocked on doors, spent hours listening to neighbors who had once waved politely, but never spoken more than a sentence. Now, they opened up like a dam had cracked. A young couple, Nick and Bree, had received 4 citations in 1 week for yard maintenance violations. Another neighbor, Sam, had been told to remove the solar panels from his roof because they didn't match the aesthetic of the block. And old Mr. Hanley? He'd sold his home last month after being served with a foreclosure threat over unpaid fines that, when James asked Sarah to review them later, turned out to be totally fabricated. It was a pattern, a slow, creeping campaign of fear and pressure. The HOA, under Karen's iron rule, was systematically targeting homeowners, mostly elderly, or those unlikely to fight back, and stacking fines on their properties. If they resisted or missed a payment, Karen swooped in with her realty connections and helped them sell for far below market value. But James wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Late one night, James sat in his dimly lit living room, stacks of documents spread across his coffee table. Across from him sat Sarah Hayes, his attorney. She clicked her pen, brows furrowed, examining a printed spreadsheet of HOA budget records they'd acquired via a formal request. "This line here," she said, pointing, "is for landscaping improvements. But if you look at the HOA's vendor payments, the money didn't go to the usual contractor. It went to a shell company named Greencrest Development LLC. James leaned in. "That's not our landscaper." "No," Sarah said. "And here's the kicker. Greencrest is registered to a PO box in downtown Austin, and the LLC is managed by a woman named Celia Grant. Ring a bell?" He nodded slowly. "Karen's sister." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Exactly. They're laundering money through fake repairs and funneling it to a private company. That's fraud, James. Plain and simple." The rage burned hot in James's chest, but this time it was sharpened into resolve. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice. And now he had a map. They needed to escalate, not just legally, but publicly. The HOA had been operating in the shadows, using intimidation and silence as weapons. It was time to bring everything into the light. They started with a town hall meeting. James worked with a few sympathetic neighbors to draft flyers. Know your rights, know the truth. They handed them out at the supermarket, taped them to lampposts, and slipped them under doors. The flyer promised transparency, exposure, and answers. And when the night came, people showed up. Not in ones or twos, but in droves. The community center overflowed with residents. Tension hung heavy in the air. Karen arrived 15 minutes late, flanked by her 2 closest board members. Her lipstick was perfect. Her heels clicked with defiance. But even she couldn't ignore the shift in the air. James stepped up to the front. Sarah stood beside him. He began not with anger, but with honesty. "My name is James Holloway. I'm a homeowner, a veteran, and until 2 weeks ago, I thought we lived in a good neighborhood, a fair neighborhood, but I was wrong. He clicked the projector remote. On the screen behind him, images flickered to life. The fence across his driveway, a copy of the forged signature, then HOA records, vendor logs, a payment trail leading to Greencrest. Sarah took over, explaining in clear legal terms how the HOA funds had been misused, how Karen had overstepped her authority, and how her actions, especially the forgery, weren't just unethical, but criminal. The room fell silent. Karen stood suddenly, her chair scraping the floor. "This is slander," she snapped. "These accusations are baseless." Sarah turned toward her calmly. "Then you won't mind us forwarding all of this to the county prosecutor, right?" Karen froze. She had no answer, and the room erupted into whispers. Karen looked around, searching for support. But this time, there were no loyal nods, just silence, the kind that spelled the end. The HOA's illusion of power had cracked. But James knew this was only the beginning. The real storm was still coming. Jack had spent the past week walking a legal tightrope with his lawyer, Marissa Kane. But nothing could have prepared him for what arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. A plain white envelope tucked behind the screen door. No postmark, no return address, just his name, scribbled in harsh black ink. He tore it open with calloused fingers, instantly recognizing the document inside. An HOA infraction notice. But this one was different. It claimed that Jack had intentionally tampered with communal property, a violation that, according to the HOA's own bylaws, could warrant fines exceeding $5,000 or, worse, forced removal from the property. Jack exhaled sharply, his heart pounding with disbelief. Tampered? With what? That's when he stepped outside and saw it. The fence was gone. Where once a steel barrier had cut across his driveway, now stood bare concrete, the faint markings of where it had been bolted down still visible. Jack's truck, which had been trapped for weeks, now sat in the open. But something wasn't right. His instincts told him this wasn't a peace offering. Across the street, Karen stood at her window, phone pressed to her ear, watching him. It was a setup. Jack rushed back inside and called Marissa. Within the hour, she was on the porch in her raincoat examining the site. "They're baiting you," she muttered, crouching near the old bolt holes. "They removed the fence to claim you destroyed it. No warning, no record of removal." Jack's blood simmered. "They're trying to bankrupt me, or force me to sell." Marissa nodded grimly. "If they succeed in proving damage to communal property, they could put a lien on your house. If we don't fight this fast, you could lose everything." She was right, and Jack knew it. This was more than a personal vendetta now. It was strategic warfare, and he wasn't their only target. That evening, Jack walked the neighborhood in a quiet storm of thought. He noticed the subtle signs. A for sale sign in front of the old Henderson's home. Neighbors who'd once stood tall, but had recently gone quiet. Weeds growing at the edge of yards that used to be meticulously cared for. Closed curtains, lowered voices. Fear. This HOA wasn't preserving the neighborhood. It was hollowing it out, house by house. Later that night, as rain lashed against his windows, Jack took out a battered photo frame, his late wife and daughter, smiling on their old porch in Texas, long before deployments, loss, and silence had weathered him down. He touched the glass. "I promised I'd build us a home, not just walls, a place worth protecting." The next morning, with fresh coffee and a renewed sense of defiance, Jack knocked on the doors of 3 neighbors. The Hendersons, Mr. Sir Everett on the corner, and Maria Diaz, the young single mom with 2 kids and a stack of fines taller than her mailbox. They sat in Jack's living room, wary but listening. "I'm not asking you to fight for me," Jack said quietly. "I'm asking you to fight for yourselves, for what they'll take from you next. We have to push back." For a beat, no one spoke. Then Maria nodded. "I have photos," she whispered, "of Karen's assistant forging timestamps on fines." Mr. Everett raised a hand. "I still have the original deed that shows my property boundary. They claimed half my front lawn was HOA's last year. took my bird bath. Jack smiled for the first time in days. It wasn't a mob yet, but it was a beginning. Marissa helped coordinate an evidence-sharing strategy. Dozens of neighbors, encouraged by the courage of just a few, began handing over documents, videos, emails. Karen had built her empire on intimidation and silence. But that silence had just broken. And Jack? He was no longer standing alone. The mood inside Carla's home had shifted from determination to exhaustion. Days of research, legal filings, and community conversations had taken a toll on both her and her small band of supporters. But despite the fatigue, they were making progress. And now, they were close to a turning point. Carla sat across from her attorney, Lisa Morales, a razor-sharp civil rights lawyer who had taken an interest in the case after reading about it online. Lisa was flipping through pages of HOA documentation, her brow furrowed. "This," Lisa said, pointing to a scanned PDF from the HOA archives, "is what we needed." Carla leaned forward. "What is it?" "It's a board meeting summary from 2 years ago, signed by the previous HOA president. In it, they clarify property boundaries after a legal land reassessment. According to this record, the strip of land your driveway sits on was officially reverted back to your parcel due to an easement expiration." Carla blinked. Meaning? Meaning the HOA hasn't had any legal claim to that land for over 24 months. They acted as if they did, but legally, they didn't. Carla's breath caught. This was it. The proof they needed to destroy the foundation of everything Margaret Green had done. "But that's not all," Lisa said, eyes gleaming. "See here, this expenditure line item? Landscape and security fence installation, requisitioned from road maintenance budget. That's financial misappropriation." Carla's eyes widened. "They used community money that was meant to fix potholes to trap me in my own home?" "Exactly," Lisa replied. "And I can almost guarantee they didn't hold a public vote for it. Margaret signed off on all this herself. Didn't even run it by the neighborhood," Carla said, suddenly recalling an offhand remark Margaret had made at the HOA meeting weeks ago. She said, "Sometimes leadership means knowing what's best without asking." Lisa smirked. That quote might just bury her. With their new ammunition, they called a press conference. Nothing flashy. Just Carla, Lisa, and a few residents who had been silently supporting her but afraid to speak out. They streamed it on Facebook Live, not expecting much. But within 24 hours, the video had amassed over 200,000 views. It struck a nerve. News outlets picked it up. Headlines read, "Veteran's widow blocked from her own driveway by HOA power trip," and "Fence of injustice. This. One woman's fight against suburban tyranny." Reporters showed up at the neighborhood gates. Residents began talking, loudly and publicly. And then the letters started arriving. Emails from former HOA board members, anonymous tips from residents, even a whistleblower, the HOA's former treasurer, came forward with scanned emails that exposed internal communication, proving Margaret had gone rogue long ago. Carla held one of those emails in her hand now. It was from Margaret to her inner circle. "Let her fight. Let her sue. She doesn't have the money, the time, or the support to win. We control the perception, and perception is everything." Carla showed it to Lisa, her hands trembling. "She underestimated me," Lisa nodded, "and that's going to be her biggest mistake." The tipping point came during a city council meeting 2 weeks later. Carla and Lisa presented the full case: forged property claims, misallocated funds, and abuse of power. The council was stunned. Councilmember Robbins, who had once supported the HOA's authority without question, sat pale-faced, reading the documentation aloud. "This isn't just a violation of rights," he said. "This is fraud, on a public and prosecutable level." Margaret Green wasn't in the room that day. She had, according to a neighbor, taken a much-needed spa vacation. But her silence only worsened her image. People were angry. Not just for Carla, but for themselves. Many realized they'd been afraid for too long, punished into silence, fined into submission. Now, with the spotlight shining bright and the truth laid bare, the tide was finally turning. As Carla stepped out into the parking lot after the meeting, an older gentleman she didn't recognize walked up to her and tipped his hat. "You gave us our voice back," he said. "Thank you." Carla smiled, for the first time in weeks, with no bitterness behind it. Just strength. The kind of strength that didn't need recognition to know it was right. She glanced toward her driveway later that night, still blocked by the fence, but not for long. Justice was on its way, and it had Carla Green's name written all over it. For days after the forged signature revelation, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers and unease. Jack's quiet stand had turned into something louder, an undercurrent of resistance rising beneath the manicured lawns and white picket fences of Windmere Hills. Karen Greenfield, however, wasn't done. When the news of Jack's accusations began making rounds, she doubled down. Jack received a sudden fine for excessive lawn ornamentation, the American flag planted proudly beside his porch. Days later, code enforcement was mysteriously called to inspect the structural integrity of his backyard deck, which hadn't been touched in years. And then came the petition. Under the guise of preserving neighborhood aesthetics, Karen circulated a form among HOA members to have Jack labeled a non-compliant resident, which could allow the HOA to place his property under formal review. If passed, it would strip him of voting rights in the HOA, and worse, open the door for forced compliance measures. But Karen had underestimated the ripple effects of what Jack and Sarah had started. Her campaign sparked unease rather than support. Neighbors, previously silenced by fear, now whispered at mailboxes and murmured at block parties. Then came the night that tipped everything over. A knock echoed on Jack's front door at 11:47 p.m. He opened it to find his front lawn vandalized. Spray painted in red across his garage door were the words, "HOA or get out." His hands trembled, not from fear, but fury. Jack called Sarah, who rushed over and stood silently beside him in the driveway. They stared at the graffiti, the flag flapping above them in the breeze. Sarah snapped a photo with her phone, then looked at Jack. "This changes everything." The next morning, local news trucks pulled into the neighborhood. Someone, no one ever admitted who, had leaked Jack's story to the media. Footage of Jack standing beside the vandalized garage aired alongside images of the illegally placed fence and Sarah's documentation of the forgery and financial mismanagement. By evening, the HOA office was flooded with calls. Karen's phone rang off the hook. Board members began distancing themselves from her. A few resigned outright. The mayor of the small town issued a statement condemning any HOA activity that infringed on resident rights. But the real blow came when Sarah received a call from the county attorney's office. They had seen the report. They wanted copies of everything. "This is it," she told Jack. "This is where we turn the tide." Fire. The courtroom buzzed with restless energy, the kind that always precedes a storm. Brian Carter sat at the plaintiff's table in a crisp navy suit, hands steady, heart pounding beneath a calm exterior. Months of tension, investigation, and sleepless nights had all led to this moment. Seated beside him was Vanessa Harlow, the fierce civil rights attorney who had taken his case not just because it was winnable, but because it was right. Across the aisle, Patricia Lockwood, the HOA president who once treated Briarwood Estates like her personal fiefdom, looked notably less composed. Her legal team whispered frantically, shuffling papers. For the first time, Patricia wasn't controlling the room. She was part of the evidence. The judge called the session to order. Vanessa stood and launched into a carefully constructed argument that laid bare the corruption of the Briarwood HOA, the unlawful seizure of Brian's land, the forged documents, the intimidation tactics used against elderly residents, and, most damning of all, the misappropriation of HOA funds. Then came the smoking gun. Vanessa presented notarized land deeds proving that Brian's driveway and a portion of the fence the HOA had erected was indisputably outside their jurisdiction. Surveillance footage showed HOA board members placing unauthorized construction materials at night. Forensics had confirmed Patricia's signature on forged permission slips, and financial audits tied HOA funds to private accounts controlled by Patricia and her closest allies. The jury sat stone-faced, absorbing every word. Patricia's once coiffed confidence had unraveled into a stiff mask of denial. Her lawyer objected, scrambled, tried to poke holes in the evidence, but it was like plugging a dam with chewing gum. Brian spoke last. He rose, his voice steady but sincere. "I served this country believing in law and fairness. I moved to Briarwood to find peace, not to fight battles. But when someone builds a wall to cut you off from your own home, tells you your rights no longer matter, you have two choices. You walk away, or you push back." He paused, scanning the room. "I pushed back, not just for me. For the families who were fined until they lost their homes. For the veterans too tired to fight. And for the young ones watching this unfold, learning what it means to stand for something." Silence swept the courtroom. The judge nodded once, then delivered the verdict. The fence was to be removed immediately. Patricia Lockwood was found guilty of property fraud, forgery, and misuse of HOA funds. She would serve time. The remaining board would be dissolved, pending further investigation. Damages were awarded to Brian, including full legal fees, plus a public apology requirement to be delivered by Patricia herself. As reporters flooded the courthouse steps, Brian didn't linger. He didn't need the cameras. He had something better. His driveway back, his home untouched, and his dignity intact. That evening, as the fence was dismantled piece by piece, neighbors gathered on their lawns in quiet solidarity. Some waved. A few approached him with coffee and gratitude. No longer afraid. No longer silent. Vanessa walked up beside him. "Told you we'd win," Brian smiled. "You didn't just win. You made them listen." As the last beam of the illegal fence was loaded into a truck, Brian stood tall beneath the orange sky, the past behind him, and the community, finally, undeniably, his.